This is the first lecture of the muscular system. In this lecture, we're going to be starting by talking about what the muscular system is for, and then going over the different kinds of muscle that are in it. We'll talk about skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle in general. Then we're going to spend most of the rest of this whole unit on skeletal muscle. Today, we'll go over the anatomy of skeletal muscle and how it interacts with bones and the relationship with joints, the idea of fascicles, and then we'll get into muscle fibers. Then we'll talk about the anatomy within a single muscle fiber, which is the same as a muscle cell, and then go have a quick functional overview, just a very broad scale of how it works, then getting into the details of how they're organized into motor units, and the first part of talking about excitation-contraction coupling. Hi, welcome to the lectures on the muscular system. So I'm trying something a little bit different now, where I'm going to be using the graphics tablet for a whiteboard, but also having this video on just so we can have a little bit of the personal eye contact and I can make gestures if need be, but you can also have the ongoing sketchbook. So I'm probably going to be spending a lot of time doing this. It's not ideal, sorry, but I'll try to make some eye contact occasionally. We'll see how this goes. If it doesn't work, we can go back to something else. So the first thing we want to talk about here is the use of, what the muscular system is for. So when we were talking sort of about our cellular spaceship and this system where we're trying to keep our cells alive and happy while they're navigating in a difficult environment like dry land, what's the muscular system for? What do muscle cells do that no other cell in the body can do? And that's not even strictly true. Most of the time what we think about is the muscular system is for movement or generation of force. So the thing that muscle cells do at least better than anyone else is that they can exert force. If you've got a muscle cell, it can pull on something and exert force on that. Now, depending on how the muscle cells are arranged, that might cause constriction of a vessel, or pulling two things together, or moving the skeleton around, or squeezing something. Lots and lots of possibilities based on how you arrange the muscle. But the general purpose is to exert force, or to move. Now, there are some cells that can move that are not muscle cells. White blood cells, for example, are famous for creeping around like little amoebas. But that's not really the same thing. Those can't exert any significant amount of force on a large scale, whereas muscle cells can. Even one muscle cell can actually exert a measurable amount of force. So we are going to be talking about the different kinds of muscle in our muscular system and how each is specialized for a different kind of exertion of force under different circumstances. So let's get to that. So if we're going to talk about types of muscle, there are three types that we see in our body. There's skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these and what makes each one special, what makes each one different from the others. So let's first talk about skeletal. And for each one, we're going to talk about where it's found, what makes it contract, what it responds to, what it looks like, we'll start with that. So with skeletal muscle, as you might guess from the name, mostly this is found attached to bones. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, the tongue, this interesting organ in the oral cavity, is made of lots of small skeletal muscles, mostly attached to each other. So what you get when you attach muscles together that way is a structure known as a muscular hydrostat that's capable of a lot of flexibility by coordinating which muscles in the hydrostat are changing shape. The hydrostat can flatten or thicken or lengthen or shorten or twist or turn in lots of interesting ways. It's the same kind of structure that you find in an elephant trunk or an octopus arm. Those are both all other kinds of muscular hydrostats, although the exact arrangement of muscles is different. So, I don't know, you could, if you wanted to, refer to your tongue as your mouth tentacle. It would be pretty much an accurate description, although it might produce odd reactions in the people you're talking to, unless they are physiologists, in which case they will be fantastically amused by that. But anyway, so usually attached to bones, but not always. In terms of what it responds to, skeletal muscle responds really to only one thing, and that is signals from lower motor neurons. Skeletal muscle does not really contract in response to hormonal changes or really any other kind of signal except signals from lower motor neurons. Now, of course, there are always, as always in physiology, exceptions. Some kinds of muscle cramps, for example, can come from a disruption in the balance of ions around a muscle cell, which changes the electrical characteristics, which causes it to contract when it otherwise wouldn't. That can give you abnormal contractions in a muscle cell. But most of the time, under normal circumstances, skeletal muscle cells only contract, in response to signals from lower motor neurons. In terms of appearance, these take the form of long, big, multinucleated fibers. So if each of these little dots is a nucleus, skeletal muscle cells can have hundreds of nuclei. The other thing that they have is this interesting stripe pattern. If you've ever looked at skeletal cells under a microscope, you've seen what I'm talking about. They are what we call striated. We'll see in a couple of other cells, other types of muscle, some differences with that. Now, another thing about these muscle cells that I would like to mention is how quickly they twitch. In other words, how rapidly do these muscle cells contract? So for skeletal muscle, that's generally somewhere in the range of 10 to 100 milliseconds. So that means anywhere from 100th to 1/10 of a second to complete one cycle of contract, relax. That's one muscle twitch, which we'll talk about in some detail later. We'll compare that to the others as we go here. So now let's talk about smooth muscle. In terms of where it is, smooth muscle is found around tubes and hollow organs. So you find smooth muscle around things like blood vessels, air passages, the digestive tract, and in a few other areas, like the muscles that control the lens and the pupil of your eye are smooth muscle. And in a way, that's around a tube, an opening maybe, kind of, sort of, anyway. So generally smooth muscle is found around places where things are going to be flowing, whether that's air or light, which doesn't really flow, but you can kind of think of it, or blood or partially digested food, or urine. Generally, smooth muscle is used to control and direct that kind of flow, also to cause the flow by producing pressure differences. In terms of what it responds to, smooth muscle is quite versatile. It responds to signals from the autonomic nervous system, that's the ANS, changes in hormones, physical force, like being stretched or poked will cause it to contract. Also, intrinsic activity, meaning sometimes smooth muscles triggers its own contraction. It doesn't wait for a signal, it just does it on its own. Sometimes on kind of a timer, which we'll talk about when we get to smooth muscle. As well as local messengers, or local environment, we'll say. So some smooth muscle, for example, is responsive to the amount of oxygen dissolved in the fluid around it. So lots and lots of possibilities for what can control smooth muscle. In terms of what it looks like, smooth muscle cells are long and skinny. Sometimes people call these spindle-shaped, and they're arranged in layers. Mononucleated, so each of them only has one nucleus. much smaller than skeletal muscle cells. Skeletal muscle cells are some of the largest cells in the body. They can be centimeters long and hundreds of micrometers across. Whereas smooth muscle cells are quite skinny and relatively short, but they come in large numbers, and you kind of stack them into layers like this. In terms of how fast they twitch, these are slow, generally in the range of 4,000 to 6,000 milliseconds. In other words, it takes these cells some number of seconds, 4 to 6 seconds, to complete a twitch generally. Contract and relax, rather than skeletal muscle, which is contract and relax like that. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, sometimes its twitches are a little odd. For example, smooth muscle is capable of something that the other two kinds of muscle are not, which is that it can lock itself. They call it a latch state, that it can contract and then hold that contraction without expending a lot of extra energy. And we don't know exactly how it does that. It's kind of interesting. We'll talk about that again when we get to smooth muscle. All right, third type, cardiac muscle. And you probably know where this is generally found. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart. What it responds to, it's primarily intrinsically controlled. The heart generally controls its own contraction. We have some specialized cells that are modified cardiac muscle called autorhythmic cells that trigger the electrical signals on their own that cause the heart to contract. And because of the way the cardiac muscle cells are arranged and attached to each other, those signals spread among them. So you get waves of contraction, so whole big sections of the heart work all at once. Some kinds of smooth muscle work similarly. We'll get to that when we talk about smooth muscle too. But cardiac is also influenced by hormones and signals from the autonomic nervous system. So sympathetic and parasympathetic activity can influence the functioning of cardiac muscle, but usually it initiates its own contractions, that idea of intrinsic activity. In terms of what it looks like, cardiac muscle is really interesting. It takes the form of fairly long, branched, and interconnected cells. And those cells are striated, much like skeletal muscle. They're much shorter than skeletal muscle cells, but they have the same kind of striations. Generally, these are mononucleated, not exclusively. Sometimes these cells can have more than one nucleus, but usually mononucleated. So unlike skeletal muscle cells, where each cell is an independent unit, and smooth muscle cells, where they're arranged in layers and tightly connected to each other, cardiac muscle cells form a branch interconnecting network, which does some interesting things to it. And we're going to talk a lot about that when we get to cardiac muscle. In terms of twitch speed, generally, here we're talking 200 to 250 milliseconds. So slower than skeletal muscle, but faster than smooth muscle. All right, so that's kind of a general overview of these types of muscle, a little bit about the differences between them. We're going to spend most of the rest of these muscular system lectures talking about skeletal muscle. And then we'll talk about, on the last one, we'll talk about smooth muscle, mostly in terms of how it's different from what we've learned about skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle we're going to leave to the next unit when we get into the cardiovascular system. So let's move on.